Hello, I'm Kristy Wallace, and this is Suddenly I See, a podcast which explores the power of a positive mindset, gratitude, and love in changing your life for the better. Join me as I share the mind hacks, rituals, and choices that have helped me survive and thrive in the face of adversity to arrive at a point where suddenly I see what truly matters in this life. Let's get started. Hey everyone, and welcome to episode 5. I guess when you see an episode that's called Rock Bottom, you know you're in for a not so fun journey, right? But I think it's really important to share how challenging life got for me. I think a lot of people assume or think that our journey was difficult, but they probably don't realize the real toll that it took on me and my mental health as well. And so this episode's going to be tricky, but I know that it's important and I know that other people will benefit from me sharing. So let's go there. A few months down the track, after I lost my dad, I'd still managed to keep going. I was in survival mode. Just keep pushing down the emotions, keep doing what you need to do to get through each day, to get to treatment, to keep the kids going. You know, you get in such a routine, don't you, on the treadmill of life, keeping your kids alive with food, with medication, with, school, daycare, all those things, that it's very easy to continue to stay in survival mode and use denial as your main coping strategy. And up until this point, that had been working pretty well for me, I'd thought. But the thing with emotions is that there's only so long you can keep denying them and pushing them down before they need to be released and come out. And I think the greatest analogy I've ever heard for this, and one that I use with the kids at school often if I'm talking about emotions, is the analogy of comparing your emotions to a fart. And so the idea being that if we spend our whole lives walking around trying to hold in the fart, eventually it's going to come out, and it might come out in a really public and a really embarrassing place. Or we might hold it in for too long and end up feeling actually quite physically unwell because of that choice. Or we can take a calm, quiet moment when no one's around to do a sneaky fart, and we continue on our life without any issues or side effects from that. And I hope this doesn't come back to bite me as the girl that talks about farts in her podcast. But I just think it's one of the clearest analogies that you can give to people with regards to emotions. You cannot just keep pushing them down. They need to come out in some way. And if you have the opportunity to take that time in a safe space to process your emotions, you'll be much better for it than some kind of emotional overwhelm and overload that happens in a really public place and is really challenging for you. So for me, my rock bottom and kind of breakdown moment just happened at home. And it was such an insignificant thing that triggered it. But at the time, it just really tipped me over the edge. So I was home with the 2 kids on my own. It was a normal work day for Fred, and we were in town. So Audrey decided, as 3-year-olds do, to do some creative expression with pseudo cream in our house. And it's something that she'd never done before. And so I was getting the kids ready for their afternoon nap, and I remember walking into what was Patty's room actually at the time and just finding pseudo cream painted like all over the change table and a few other places. And it just absolutely broke me. And I went into this just unexplained kind of fit of rage over the fact that Audrey had done this, and there was just mess everywhere. And I couldn't believe she'd done it. And it so wasn't about the pseudo cream. It was everything else that I'd been pushing down for months that was underneath it. But I erupted and fell apart and turned into this, horrible, shouting, screaming, irrational mum. And I put her into bed because I knew it was nap time and I just couldn't deal with it. And I got to that point where I was just, when you get so filled with rage that you're actually shaking and you think, but your brain's like, but it's pseudo cream, it's not that big a deal. But for me, it was just absolute tipping point. And I put her into bed, and she was obviously upset and crying because she knew she'd upset me in such an extreme way, and she'd never really seen that before either. And so I came out into the kitchen after she'd gone into the bedroom, and I remember just looking frantically around thinking, I've got to get out of this place. I cannot stay here. I've got to get out of here. But knowing that I was also a mum and I had Paddy still in a little bouncer on the floor, so I couldn't leave him, and Audrey's crying in a bedroom. And I just fell on the floor where I was and felt like such a failure. And I cried the deepest, most guttural tears I think I've ever cried in my life. I can't think of another time that I've cried that deeply about anything. And it's to the point where you can't breathe, you know, the really good cry where it's like there's snot, there's tears, there's that tightening in your chest where you feel like you can't actually even breathe. Like it was such an overwhelming feeling. But during it all, I kept looking over at Paddy on the floor not far from me thinking, what is this kid thinking? Like he can't see anything and all he can hear is this mess of a mother on the floor who can't keep it together. And I thought, I actually shouldn't be a parent at this point. Like I'm failing my kids so much that I don't think I should be a parent anymore. And I need to just get out of here. But there was no way that I actually could. And it's interesting in like thinking back to plan this episode a bit. I thought, well, what did you do after, Kristy? Like, what did you do? And I can't remember. Like, I cannot even remember what happened after that point of just sheer breakdown on the floor. I can only assume I would have put Paddy to bed and given myself a nap. At the time, we were just completely off our face, sleep deprived as well, because Paddy was still waking multiple times a night, every night. And so sleep deprivation was a big factor in this, you know, tipping point, I think, as well. But anyway, I managed somehow to make it through to the evening, and Fred came home from work, and later that night when it was time to put the kids to bed, something happened again, and I can't even remember what it was. I think it was just that I was holding on by a thread, to be honest. And I just broke again and thought the only instinct I had was run, get out of here, run, like just leave. But again, that same scenario of like, where are you going to run to? In my head, I thought you can't hop in a car. You're too irrational. You're too upset. You're too overwhelmed to be in a vehicle. That's not safe. But it's dark now outside. And where are you going to run to? And so I walked out the back door and made it just basically to the front veranda. And again, that feeling of when you want to run, but you know you can't because of your responsibilities or physical environment makes you feel so incredibly trapped. And it makes it feel like you're really just stuck in this pressure cooker kind of thing. And so I went to the front veranda and looked up at the sky, and here's this big, beautiful moon. So then, of course, I just collapsed down on the floor again and started literally like howling in tears again, because it just reminded me so much of Dad and brought up all this huge grief I had around the fact that now I'd lost Dad as well. And I just hated my life so much. And I hated that though I couldn't stop. When you've got a sick kid, you feel like you can't even take a break because they still need you. It's actually one of the most trapped and limited feelings I've ever had, was parenting Paddy while he was unwell, because there was just not really any space, or I felt like at the time there was no space for me to just step aside and have a break. I couldn't hop off this horrible treadmill. And I remember using that analogy even back then. I felt like I was trapped on a treadmill that I really wanted to get off, but I knew I couldn't. And so there was, in that state of mind and that complete, you know, what I understand now is catastrophic thinking, there was no escape as far as I could see it. And so I don't know how long I was on the veranda howling for, but I know that Fred came out and eventually managed to coax me back inside. And my biggest concern at the time was that if I'm going to keep having breakdowns like this that are so just off tap with, you know, rage and grief and frustration and all the things, that I was actually teaching my kids then to end up in domestic violence relationships, was basically where my head had gone with this. Because if I'm going to behave in such an upset, rageful, aggressive kind of way and then go and apologize later, because obviously I feel like absolute shit for acting like that in front of my children, I'm teaching them in a way to accept that behavior from future partners. And let's bear in mind that, Audrey was 3 and Patty was 1, but that was a genuine fear I had. And I felt, because I'd done that really once, that now I'd ruined their lives and I was setting them up for that kind of relationship in 20 years' time. And I came inside and sat on the lounge and started Googling mental institutions, because I thought I need to not be with my kids because I'm not a safe person for them. And that breaks your heart, because you're meant to be that person. And I tried so hard to be for so long, but I think all of the emotions that I hadn't processed and all the grief that came with Patty's diagnosis and losing my dad had actually got the better of me. And I felt I could no longer control my emotions and how I was reacting. I was no longer rational. And so for me, that meant it was unsafe for me to be around my kids. And I remember when I was Googling it, like I couldn't really find anything. Like, where do you go? And it was, if I was an alcoholic, I could find a great little place to, hang out and get over my addiction, or not to, diminish addiction. But when you have a mental illness, to try and you're trying to look for help and find a space where you can just escape and process what you need to process, there was nothing really that I could find online. And so that made me feel a little bit trapped again as well, because I thought, well, I want to fix it, but I don't even know how to fix this. And I can't find a space where I can go to retreat to fix this. So what happens? And the next day, I still can picture being in the kitchen, and my mum had come up to visit and was talking to Fred. And I remember saying to them, I think I just need to get some help. And they agreed that they were worried about me as well, and I probably need to get some help. And so I decided to make an appointment with the GP and see if she could do something to support me with what we were going through. And it's interesting because this was years ago, before I kind of worked in that well-being space and I had a bit more compassion and understanding for it. But I know even back then, if someone was struggling, the first thing you would do is tell them to go and see the doctor, and it's okay, and there's no shame in that. And that's what I genuinely felt in offering that advice to other people. But my God, sitting in that doctor's reception, waiting to go in and say, I have a problem, I need help, was just the worst feeling. And I remember nearly thinking, I think I'm going to leave. Like, I don't think I can even just sit here, because in my head, I was just beating myself up for being such an epic failure and getting to this point, which I know is so wrong. Like, hello. And in hindsight, it makes no sense. But at the time, that's genuinely how I felt. I felt like a complete and utter rock bottom failure. Luckily, our GP is an exceptional woman with incredible compassion and understanding and kindness and great knowledge of mental health. And so I shared with her what had been going on, and she basically asked if I had ever had any shortness of breath. And I'm like, yes, actually, like every time I'm getting the kids in the car and we're going somewhere, I find by the time I get them in and then I sit in the front seat, and as I'm driving, I'm just panting. And I think, like I had a reasonable level of fitness. I'd been training for a triathlon, like before this happened with Patty. I was still walking regularly. I was taking, pretty good care of my health. So I was surprised at why I was puffing all the time. And that's when she was like, I think you're actually probably been having some kind of, panic anxiety attacks. And I'm like, oh, that makes sense. And, in hindsight, it makes a lot of sense, because a lot of the time when I was in the car, what was worrying me or what I was running through my head was, who am I going to see? What are they going to ask me? How are the kids going to behave? Paddy obviously couldn't join in the way other kids his age could. So if we were going to a music group or going to the playground for a play date with others, it was going to stand out again that Paddy was different in some way. And there was going to be maybe questions from kids as well. And so I guess in my head, I was playing out all these unknown scenarios, which makes perfect sense as to why I was starting to have panic attacks around that. But until she mentioned it and labelled it as that, I honestly just thought I was unfit and panting to get through life. So from there, she did some standardized testing. Interestingly, for all I'd been through and all I was feeling and all I was reacting, I didn't actually meet the criteria. I wasn't mentally unwell enough to meet the criteria to access What Medicare provides is like 12 mental health counselling sessions. But to her credit, she said, look, I can see you're having a really tough time, and what you've been through is, is a bit extreme. And so I'm just going to actually write you that referral, and you're going to have access to those 12 counselling sessions. And I'm so grateful that she did that. But it also makes me genuinely question, how bad do we have to be in this country before we can access some mental health support? And how much better our society could be if we did lower the bar, and when people genuinely put their hand up and said, please, I'm struggling, I need help, we could provide them with some help. Imagine that. Instead of getting to a complete, crisis point where you're at a hospital or you're having suicidal thoughts before you can actually access some kind of support. So thankfully, I had a GP, like I said, with great understanding, and who gave me the golden ticket that I needed to be able to access some counselling services. The other challenge at this time was obviously I wasn't able to go to work and return to work after maternity leave with Paddy. I needed to be his full-time carer. And so financially, I think people just assume we'll just go to a counsellor. But that's something when you have no income coming in, that is quite a challenge and a barrier as well. And so I was lucky that the counsellor that I had was able to bulk bill me for my sessions, which meant I could go and get the help I needed. But in saying that, finding a counsellor that's right for you is also, in a way, a challenge. And I remember after my first session with her thinking, oh, what a waste of time that was. She doesn't even understand what I'm going through. And she told me to light a candle, like my blind baby might just knock it over and set the house on fire. That was a genuine thought that I had, which shows how far gone down the rabbit hole I was. And a good friend of mine who actually works in psychology space said, please give this woman 3 sessions. Don't write her off after one. Like, she's got to get to know you as well. And you can't expect in 1 hour that she will know everything about you and know how to, best guide you on that. Like, see her out, give her at least 3 sessions before you pull the pin on that. And that was outstanding advice, because it was only after a couple more sessions with her that she handed me this sheet of paper, because I was telling her basically about the ideas I'd had around yelling and screaming around the kids and them then ending up in DV relationships later. And I remember she looked at me and said, did you honestly believe that? And I said, yeah, of course. Yeah, that's what's going to happen now, because I'm a bad parent and this is what I'm doing to my child because I can't keep it together and I can't cope and I'm flying off the handle at stuff. And she was like, oh, I'm just going to print you a piece of paper and get you to have a read of it. And again, I kind of thought, oh, that'll help. Anyway, I read this piece of paper and I was like, yeah, I do that. Yep, I do that. Yep, yeah, I've always, like, even as a young child, I was always planning escape routes out of places. Like, what if in my own bedroom, what if someone came to kill me at night? How would I get out of there? Where would I hide? On an aeroplane, I was the person that had always counted the seats to the exit before they told you to count the seats to the exit. Like, I was always prepared for any challenge, adventure, obstacle that was going to come my way, and I was going to find a way out of it. And that's just how my brain had actually always worked. And there was a section in there as well about catastrophic thinking, and it described some examples of that. And I thought, yes, I've always done that as well. Like, sometimes it started as a joke where when you were sick, you'd say, oh, I'm dying, but then quite often I could catastrophize something really quickly. That was a natural go-to for me. And after I read this sheet of paper, she said, do you identify with anything on this page? And I'm like, this is me on a whole page. Like, I identify with everything here. And she's like, this is, a lot of the symptoms of having generalized anxiety disorder. And I thought, oh, well, sign me up, because that's what I've got. And actually, you would think, well, I guess everyone reacts differently. For me, knowing that that was a diagnosis kind of lifted a weight, because it made me feel like, actually, that's not who you are. That's an illness now that you have. And I thought, and everything suddenly, like I said, even younger years, everything made sense, because this is how I'd always thought. And I didn't realize that was a problem. And actually, for a lot of my life, it probably wasn't a problem until I hit, some really deep challenges and trauma in life. And suddenly this anxiety just became bigger than Ben-Hur. But because I knew what it was, I felt empowered that now I could actually change this. I had the awareness. And I remember even leaving that session and walking out, I'd got messages then from the Children's Hospital in Sydney organising appointments, and my brain instantly went to planning mode and option A, B, C, D. What if this happens? Then if that happens, what if? And I remember thinking, hold on, this is what you were just told you shouldn't be doing, but that your anxiety brain will make you do. And so I had to pare it back and go, okay, why don't you wait and see what happens before you start planning all these things? And that was a small step, but it was the first moment I actually became aware of how I was approaching things and my thoughts. And I think when you have the awareness, it's so important, because then you have the ability, like I say, to learn the skills and knowledge that you need to be able to change things as well. So takeaways from this episode. Oh, there's a lot. I think the first one that's really important, like I said with the analogy at the beginning of the farts, is that you can only actually push down your emotions and stay in survival mode for so long. But the only way to actually get through it is to let that fart out, let that emotion out, and you've got to sit in it and you've got to work your way through it. And how I did that, I'll share a little bit more in coming episodes. Obviously, rock bottom's, where it all comes up, but how you get through it is what I'll share in coming episodes. The second takeaway I think is important is asking for help. And also, if you've got someone around you that you can see is struggling, offer help. It's one of the hardest things I had to do was to admit that I needed help, and then to go and actually share that with a general practitioner. It was so incredibly hard. And so if you can support someone through that process, or just be that voice that says, yeah, that's a great idea. Why don't I drive you down? Do you want me to come and sit with you in the waiting room? Do whatever you can to help that person access the support that they need, because it's a life-changing moment for them. Third takeaway is counsellors are like hairdressers. You have to find your one. But I think it's really important as well, and I really appreciate advice from my friend there, to make sure you give it a solid go before you chop and change, because people do need more than 1 hour to get to know you and, your experience and what your needs are. So go into it with a mindset that it's not going to happen straight away, and give yourself the grace of a couple of sessions before you decide if that's for you or not. The final one that I think I can see now in hindsight, at the time, crying on the floor with the kids upset and feeling like I'd ruined everyone's life, was the still horrible, horrible feeling. But when I look back now, I can see that's the moment actually that my life shattered on the ground in a million pieces. And I realized that for too long I'd been trying to hold on to my old life. And that was the moment that I realized I needed to actually drop everything from my old life and let it shatter on the floor. But from there, I could actually rebuild and, create a life for my family and for myself that became actually even better than the one I had before. But I couldn't see that then. So I guess the takeaway is, what feels like your greatest failure or moment of rock bottom in hindsight could actually become your place of your greatest rebirth. So take some comfort from that. Thanks so much for joining me for this episode. I really appreciate you following along our journey and sticking with me throughout this process. Thanks. I hope this episode has given you something to reflect on, or some tools that you can implement in your own life. If you know someone who could benefit from this episode, please share it with your family or friends. It would mean so much to me. Remember to stay positive, be grateful, and take each step of the journey with kindness and love in your heart. Until next time, bye.